Joe Rogan didn't set out to become one of the most controversial voices in modern media, but somewhere between a comedy club stage, a UFC cage-side mic, and a couple thousand podcast episodes, he became a problem that even a billion-dollar corporation couldn't solve. Because when your audience is bigger than entire television networks, the usual rules stop applying, and no one learned that lesson harder than Spotify. In the early 2000s, if you asked people who Joe Rogan was, you'd probably hear the guy from Fear Factor or the UFC commentator. He was a familiar face but far from a household name. Then came December 2009. Rogan and his friend Brian Redband sat down in front of a webcam and began talking into cheap microphones. They streamed it live on Ustream. The early shows were chaotic, no format, no plan, just tangents about aliens, conspiracies, and comedy club stories. They called it the Joe Rogan Experience. Slowly the numbers began to rise from a few hundred viewers to a few thousand. By the mid-2010s, Rogan's show was racking up millions of downloads per month. He wasn't just a comic anymore, he was building a media empire in his spare room. By 2018, Rogan was pulling in an audience so massive that traditional media couldn't ignore it. Forbes reported in September 2020 that Rogan was earning an estimated $30 million annually from his podcast. Sponsors were paying absurd rates for a single mention. One episode featuring Elon Musk smoking a joint live on camera became a global meme and has over 70 million views on YouTube. A Time magazine article pegged Rogan's podcast as reaching roughly 11 million listeners per episode, numbers rivaling cable news primetime shows. He was interviewing scientists, celebrities, authors, politicians, and sometimes fringe figures banned from other platforms, and from this his fanbase was fiercely loyal, but that loyalty came at a cost. In May 2020, news dropped that Spotify had signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive licensing deal reportedly worth at least $100 million. Some outlets, including the New York Times, reported that the real figure was closer to $200 million once the signing bonuses and ad revenue splits were included. Spotify was trying to transform itself from a music company to a podcast powerhouse, and Rogan was supposed to be their centerpiece. The day the deal was announced, Spotify's stock jumped nearly 11%. All seemed perfect, until the reality of exclusive Rogan hit them like a freight train. Shortly after Rogan's move to Spotify, employees inside the company started raising alarms. Articles from Vice revealed that some staff demanded editorial oversight over Rogan's episodes, particularly interviews with controversial guests like Alex Jones. By late 2020, Spotify staff were staging virtual walkouts, insisting that the platform either remove or censor certain episodes. Daniel Ek, Spotify's CEO, held firm. "We're not in the business of dictating the discourse that these creators want to have on their shows," but the friction didn't stop there. In late 2021, Rogan became a lightning rod for vaccine controversies. He hosted guests who questioned official COVID-19 narratives, including Dr. Robert Malone, who was banned from Twitter at the time for allegedly spreading misinformation. Early the next year, Neil Young delivered an ultimatum to Spotify. They can have Rogan or Young, not both. Spotify chose Rogan. Young pulled his entire catalogue. Johnny Michel, Crosby, Stills and Nash and other artists soon followed, and reported that Spotify faced growing pressure under the hashtag Delete Spotify, which trended for weeks. Yet even as musicians fled, Rogan's numbers barely dropped. February 2022 brought Rogan's biggest crisis yet. A video montage went viral on social media showing Rogan using the N-word on multiple podcast episodes. He posted an apology via Instagram.
There's no context where a white person is ever allowed to say that word, and it looks fucking horrible, even to me.
In response, Spotify quietly removed over 70 episodes from their platform. In articles dated 2022, it was reported that Spotify's market value dropped roughly $2 billion in a single week as investors grew nervous after the loss of Neil Young and the N-word scandal. But inside Spotify, executives were running the math. Even after the controversy, Rogan was still pulling in more listeners than any other podcast in existence. Spotify couldn't afford to lose him. Throughout the next 2 years, leaked figures hinted at Rogan's continued dominance. Bloomberg reported that Joe Rogan's show was still around 9 million followers ahead of Spotify's next biggest shows. Edison Research 2025 Infinite Dial report once again named the Joe Rogan Experience the most listened to podcast in America, making Spotify realize they couldn't cancel Joe Joe Rogan because he was their podcast business. By late 2023, industry chatter exploded. Variety and The Verge speculated about Rogan leaving Spotify entirely. Some reports claim that he wanted to return to YouTube, frustrated by Spotify's walled garden approach. Others suggested Spotify was tired of defending him, but behind the scenes negotiations were happening and they were about to reshape the entire podcast landscape. Early the next year, Spotify announced a new deal with Rogan. Unlike the original agreement, this wasn't fully exclusive. Rogan's podcast would now be distributed on multiple platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon. The price tag reports varied, but outlets like Bloomberg and the New York Times estimated it at $250 million. Daniel Ek, speaking to investors, said, "The future of podcasting isn't closed ecosystems, it's reach." Spotify retained the rights to sell ads for Rogan's show, ensuring they still profited from his audience even outside of their own app. It was a subtle admission of defeat. Fans flooded the comments, "So happy you're back on YouTube, I guess the Spotify contract expired, and Spotify lawyers must be pissed right now." Spotify realized something critical. Keeping Rogan locked away was costing them growth. Even in 2025, Rogan remains a lightning rod for controversy. He sparked outrage discussing election fraud theories.
How the election went down in terms of was there 0.01% fraud? Was there 0.5% fraud? How much fraud was there? We gotta assume that when there's people counting stuff, there's some fuckery going on.
Mainstream outlets like the Washington Post reported on advertisers pressuring Spotify for tighter moderation. But Spotify's strategy had changed. Instead of deleting episodes, they quietly demonetized segments. Internally, Spotify accepted that Rogan would occasionally spark outrage, but losing him entirely would cost them much more. So next time you hear Joe Rogan's voice on Spotify, remember behind every episode is a story of $1 billion gamble, a corporate crisis, and one man who refuses to play by anyone else's rules. If you enjoyed this breakdown, drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments who should I cover next, because trust me, there's always another story waiting to blow up.